Kevin, great
Hello.
to see you again, sir.
Good
Great
to
to
see
see you.
you.
Wonderful.
Having me.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to dive right in if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Kevin, so many people know you as the physician, educator, right? Creator of this beautiful documentary called Pleasure Unwoven. But before any of that, you were simply someone whose life was turned upside down by addiction, right? So, would you be willing to take us back there? Who was Kevin McCauley before addiction even entered the picture?
Yeah, well, that's I don't know. I just turned 60, so I guess that's the point at which you start going back and thinking a little bit about, how you might have done things differently or what things were like. Usually I don't think about the past too much. But I came to addiction fairly late in life, which is probably one reason why I'm alive. I suppose if I were to do a history, I was the son of a single woman who was battered when she was pregnant, who basically raised me alone, and was a nurse, and then became an obstetrician gynecologist. And I went to a school in Oakland, California. I did not know it at the time, but that I was actually in class with my future spouse. We reconnected later in life. But since my mother had gone to medical school, there wasn't a lot of money. And so I decided that I would get a scholarship from the Navy to go through medical school. And I was very, very happy to be in the Navy. In fact, I was happier to be in the Navy than I was to be in medical school, to be honest with you. And I did my internship, and then I went to flight surgeon school, which is a thing, believe it or not. It's a 6 month training period where you learn how to do aviation medicine, basically, where you learn how to be this doctor for a squadron, or you work in a clinic, or you work on a ship. And everything was going great. I was exactly where I wanted to be. I had a Marine Corps helicopter squadron, and then I moved over to the jet fighter community. And I had the main training squadron for the F-18 Hornet. And so there was lots of flying, and pilots are very interesting. And I can't say that I had any trauma. I had the untreated childhood ADHD, but I seem to have adjusted to that a little bit. And I certainly didn't have any addiction or alcohol problems. But then I had to have a surgery if I wanted to stay in the Navy, and if I wanted to stay flying, I had to have this surgery. And so I had the surgery. And at the end of it, I got a bottle of Percocet. And, you know, let's jump forward 6 months later, I'm shooting Demerol. And there was no consciousness whatsoever that there was any risk to opioid prescriptions at that time. Today we understand, a lot more about how people can be exposed to opioids and develop opioid use disorder. But that was, I really try to draw on that to understand other professionals who are impaired, and I definitely was, because it's just so hard to reach out for help. And at the time, if I had pilots who had alcohol use disorder, and there was a protocol for getting them through, getting them evaluated and then getting them treated if they in fact, did rule in, and then getting them back into the cockpit. And that was the idea, that it's safer to allow people to come forward earlier on in their problem, so that they can get treatment. You're more likely to prevent mishaps than you are to cause mishaps by having a program like this. And this program is replicated in the commercial aviation sector as well. But that just didn't exist for drugs. And so I knew that if I didn't fix this myself, I was going to be in big trouble. And of course, now we all understand that that's simply not possible. So I eventually I went through a series of things where I was trying to incapacitate my ability to get Demerol, and so I ripped up all of my California triplicate prescriptions in a moment of self determination, and then I just started forging them or stealing them from forging prescriptions or stealing Demerol from the branch clinic pharmacy. So it's always interested me in what people do to themselves when they're trying to get sober. They actually
Mhm.
just kind of really turn up the heat. if they don't have a way out. And so I did, and so I got caught, and everyone was really pissed off. I really have a lot of sympathy for both the healthcare provider, but also the employer, the people around that help, the people working with, the colleagues of that person, when it finally comes to light that you're dealing with an impaired clinician. Uh, and this was a long time ago. This does not happen anymore. I'm very, very happy to say everybody's come a long way, including me. But basically, if you were a drug user and an officer and a physician in the military, you went to prison. And so I did. And so they stuck me in Leavenworth for a year. They stuck me first at the Camp Pendleton Brig in solitary confinement for about 90 days. So that kind of got my attention a little bit. Never really came out of there the same person, to be honest with you. So I don't recommend that. I don't recommend putting mentally ill people in disciplinary segregation. That would just be my general advice to the world. But interestingly, before I went to Leavenworth, I'd kind of reported myself to the California Medical Board, because back then they had a way that you could do that. They don't anymore. And I was just kind of enveloped by their community of recovering doctors in Orange County, California, where I lived at that time. And they really kind of wrapped me in bubble wrap, in a sense, so that when I went through prison, I was always kind of aware of the fact that there was this field, this growing field called addiction medicine, and that maybe all of this misery could be turned into something positive in the long run. And I really think that was the buffering factor. No one was ever mean to me or nasty to me. In fact, it was really kind of moving. Again, I felt sort of sorry for the 3rd Marine Air Wing, because I can remember at my court martial, the prosecutor saying, well, doctors don't use drugs. Doctors don't use drugs. He kept saying that over and over again. And the fact of the matter is, it's not good, but they do. But the point he was making is that this is way out of keeping with our view of what a physician should be. And that certainly was true. But their attitude was more, this is really tragic, but we can't send a message to our junior enlisted that we allow officers to do this and get away with it. And man, could I understand that. I mean, that was just completely. So I didn't think that I would go away for so long, but I did a federal year. So in the federal system, there's no probation or parole. You do your entire sentence, which is 85%, is the lowest you could get. So I did that. And again, the brig was not easy. There was a lot of yelling and screaming at the brig, but that's just kind of, Marines. But Leavenworth was much, much better. I was with other officers. A lot of us were not exactly hardened criminals. I think one of my friends was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was a KC-135 pilot, so that's a big tanker. And he was there for adultery. So apparently, that's a bad thing. He didn't get as much time as I did, but all of these guys I surrounded myself with were all short timers, and one of whom I actually stayed in contact with for a long time. And then when I got out of Leavenworth, the Navy paid for all of my treatment, I'm happy to say. So I stayed in inpatient treatment for 4 months. I loved it. I had a great experience. And then I was kind of out in the world. When I got to treatment, I actually had been rearrested by California. So there were the charges that the military had, and then there were the charges that California had. And the prosecutor in Orange County was pretty strict, and he said he wanted to send me back to prison, and the judge interrupted that, and that kind of pissed him off. So he got even angrier, and he said, "Well, you're going to be on formal probation for 5 years." And at the time it was, well, you'll just do 2 and then they'll let you off if you can stay sober and all of that. So I wasn't really thinking 5 years. I was thinking 2 years. It ended up being 5 years because they just wouldn't let me off. And so that kind of puts a person into a situation where, you have to stay sober. There's just no room for error. And that was kind of the setup for the second film that I made, is how do you do that? How do you stay sober when your brain is just still off? But I did, and I managed to get through that. And unfortunately, if you take someone out of medicine for 5 years, that's really permanent. And so I tried very, very hard to get back. I left no stone uncovered. If anyone gave even the slightest hint that they might, make a place for me in a residency, because I hadn't been trained at that point. So that was really, there was this catch 22 where I couldn't get a training spot because I didn't have a license, and I couldn't get a license because I hadn't been trained. And there really was just no way around that. Today, that would not happen. Today, I think, people are much more understanding, but I have to say, there's always been work to do. We had a huge epidemic of overdose that was coming, and the world learned a little bit about opioids. And I was just sort of, if they always said, if the only thing you do is put your recovery first, everything else will fall into place.
Mhm.
And I thought that was ridiculous, but that's exactly what happened. And I was just kind of shepherded from one job to the next, rather lovingly, I think, handed off from one job to the next. And now I'm in a dream job where I'm working with many of the people that you've interviewed for your organization, are my colleagues. They are much more advanced in their profession, but I get to work with them, and I get to listen to them, and I get to, ask them questions, and it's just a wonderful thing. So I'm a senior fellow, which is a group of people at this particular program, and I would say I'm the most junior senior fellow, but I work there full time, and I do what is a fixture of addiction treatment, where you get a lecture from a doctor on the neuroscience of addiction, and I do that lecture about 14 to 16 times a month. There were times in my life that I did it almost 30 to 40 times a month, but that's kind of calmed down. But over 25 years, that tends to add up, and so in some way or another, I've done that lecture about 4,000 times. I actually count; those are the ones I can prove, and after you do something about they say if you do something for 10,000 hours, you're an expert.
10,000
Well, I
hours.
wouldn't say it's 10,000, but it's at least 8,000 hours of standing in front of people and trying to read the room and getting a sense of what it is that people will respond to, or that they even can hear about the neuroscience of addiction. What is that part that they cannot? Because there's definitely areas that I just don't think, especially Americans, can go. They're not ready. A lecture that I would give in England or Canada or Australia would be very different from a lecture that I would be able to give in the United States. But I think that, like I got when I was in treatment, it's a very moving thing personally to be introduced to this neuroscience. I would say it's a spiritual thing when people try to make sense of what it is that has happened to them. And the neuroscience of addiction goes a long way, I think, to validating the experience of people with addiction, and to explaining a little bit more accurately about what's going wrong. So I hope I didn't take too much time there, but
No,
hope
this is
that
beautiful. So,
kind of the
what,
setup.
a number of those 4,000 talks have been dedicated to training professionals like myself. So, you and I first were introduced a number of years ago. So, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and also a certified sex addiction therapist.
Right.
The body which certifies us is called ITAP, International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. And on that process of being certified as a sex addiction therapist, they also have a track called multi-addiction, CMAT, Certified Multi-Addiction Therapist. And that's where you and I had the privilege of getting to listen to you teach and get certified as a multi-addiction with a focus on substances and alcohol, right? And this was a number of years back. Patrick and I had an opportunity earlier this year to come see you give another lecture here in Los Angeles area. And tying in the Orange County piece, I introduced myself again and you asked, hey, where do you live? Oh, I live in Orange County. Oh my goodness, it took you right back to to your days in Tustin, El Toro base, all that business. I can't help but to think the person, I can't recall who that was, judge, whomever it was, said doctors don't use drugs. Whomever that was speaking to you
Right. It was
at the
the
time,
JAG prosecutor.
JAG
Yeah.
prosecutor.
And Again,
Doctors don't
not a
use
mean
drugs.
person at all, but just very
No.
clear about, how much I had departed the
But that type of phrasing,
Mhm.
that type of pointedness, leads me to believe that that JAG officer, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, was trying to coerce you into this thing called willpower.
Right,
um,
right.
so when did you, Kevin, first realize that this wasn't simply a problem of willpower anymore?
Well, it was a process of dawning on me, like it is, I think, for all of us. You find yourself in a cell, and you start asking yourself questions like, "Am I a sociopath?" And
Mm,
and I was thinking, well, maybe that's the first thing a sociopath tells himself. You're not a sociopath. Don't worry about it. Don't even think about it. But I kind of decided I wanted to try to figure out what was the fundamental, error in my character and my thinking about how I could, violate the biomedical ethical standards of my profession. So the first thing I did when I got out of solitary confinement, I had access to a library, was give myself a little ethics course. And I was happy to see that everything was intact and I was very, very connected to, what I had done wrong. But there was just a part of me, and I think that what was so strange was, even when I was in solitary confinement, I still wanted to use drugs. And you would think that with the obvious evidence of the obvious consequences of my drug use, that would have some deterrent effect. I mean, we all took Psychology 101. We all learned about behaviorism and how powerful it is. Why was this failing? And it just occurred to me that the phenomenology of addiction, in other words, the actual feel of what it's like to
mhm,
be a person with addiction, included this experience of craving. I haven't seen it in everybody with addiction, but it seems to me that this is a pretty common part of the experience of addiction. And when you're in that state of craving, you just don't care.
mhm.
If you put a gun to my head, I don't care. And there's got to be a way for me to get this drug into my brain before the bullet comes through my skull. And that was very clear to me that volition, as we traditionally define it, or free will, crazy, or whatever word you want to use from whatever analysis, be it legal or philosophical or medical or psychiatric or psychological, something was not right, and that it departed our folk psychology about what choice is. And that's been the quest basically over the
Yeah.
last almost 3 decades now, is, how could volition so completely fail, and then how could it come back? And then how could it be kind of half on, and then how could it be 100% off, and then that experience that I think is laid out so well, described so well in the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous, uh, is really the key. How can you match that up with what we believe to be true about choice, and what we know to be true about the neuroscience of addiction? And clearly, there are some discontinuities there. I think, ever since John Hinckley took a shot at and ever since he shot President Reagan, the idea of diminished capacity has just not been something that Americans wanted to listen to. Whereas if you go to the UK, if you go to really any Commonwealth country, the McNaughton rule is a much more understood idea that, yes, you can have gradations of criminal intent, but not in the United States. And so trying to get our legal theory matched up with this neuroscience, I think, is the coming battle, is really the coming challenge, is how do we take this neuroscience into court and teach the world that we have to not give up our understanding of free will, but that it is more nuanced than we've been giving it credit for. Does that make sense?
It does. And I guess the theme that I'm hearing is that addiction isn't a moral failure, right? It's not a moral failure.
Well, yeah, but I
Go
mean,
ahead.
this is part of the thing is it's not a choice, it's not a moral failing, except that it is. That's what's so interesting is that when I was forging scripts, there was a part of my consciousness that was
Sure.
100% on, and it was judging exactly what the causal chain was to be able to get drugs into my hand. And there it was a moral failing. Is I lied, I cheated, I stole. I didn't believe that I was truly an inherently a liar, cheat, and a thief. But I think that the philosopher Owen Flanagan actually talks about this quite a bit. Is what role should shame play in
Mhm.
motivating people to get sober? And I don't think we would want to, get rid of those things. Again, I think it's more nuanced, and there's a more useful, I think, way of using these words. But there's no question about the fact I was guilty. I didn't go through a trial. I
Sure.
allocated because I was guilty. The question is that it? Is
Sure.
that it for the rest of a person's life? Just write them off. And I think what you have is really much more synonymous with the kinds of impairment that you see in neurology, where you have almost a neglect phenomenon where a person literally cannot see. You've seen where you ask a patient who's had a stroke to draw a clock, and they put all the numbers in one side of the clock. That hemianopsia, that prosopagnosia, whatever you want to call it, that seems to be more akin to what's actually but the actual consequences, are truly as the law defines them. There is a victim, and justice will demand that be addressed. So I think that there are things people say in AA and in treatment that are designed to push back against that folk
Mhm.
psychology view of choice, but you can't completely say that this is not a moral failing or that this doesn't have at least aspects of choice. Where the interesting part is like where's what do we have to understand more deeply to truly understand addiction?
So maybe you can help tease this out for me then, Kevin. So one of the ideas that you've talked about for years is viewing addiction as a safety issue rather
Right.
than a moral issue. Maybe you
Right.
can tease that out a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So, very briefly, one of the things you learn how to do in flight surgeon school is prevent mishaps. That's a major part of aviation medicine, is to try to make sure that tin doesn't land in the ground. And there's a process for that. I mean, it's an entire science. And I would say this is the science of occupational safety. It gets even more detailed when you talk about the science of risk management. And it started to occur to me that all of that could be applied to the special problem that I think everybody faces as they stand on the threshold of recovery, which is, how do I go forward and stay sober when I can't really count on my brain
Right.
alone? And this is essentially where you can take all of those rules of aviation mishap prevention and apply to relapse prevention, and they fit quite beautifully, actually. So I think of addiction as a disorder in my ability to process risk, basically. If you want to say addiction's a disorder of volition, I think the part of the brain that
Mhm.
fails is that ability to really assess what is going to happen in the future. And as a person with addiction, I overvalue future intoxication related things, and I overvalue the probability that they will turn out as I expect them to, and I undervalue any consequences that might result and underestimate the probability that those consequences will in fact come true. So I get the math wrong. And it's that blindness to risk, that hemianopsia, if you like, for risk, that destroys my ability to make decisions. So if what are the things that I can put in my life external to myself that will support uh, me in those moments where I'm just not seeing the world clearly? I'm completely impaired. And for me, a lot of that was spiritual, but a lot of it was also the social connectivity that I had to the people around me, specifically to the group, which has always been fairly small, but the immediate group of sober men in my life who
Mm.
can point this out to me in a way that I can hear, because I'm probably not going to be able to hear it very well if it comes from my mother or the California Medical Board or some kind of
Right.
authority figure. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And, I'm thinking, there's a common thread on this platform anyway, with our audience, a majority of us that
Mm-hmm.
are part of this platform either have been in recovery or new to recovery, right? And
Right.
um, I heard what you just shared, and I suspect there might still be one or two folks in our audience today that still secretly believe maybe I'm just weak. Right? Maybe
Right.
I'm just weak. When you hear that type of messaging,
Yes.
what does Dr. McCauley say? Share with them in that moment. What would you want those folks to understand?
Sure, it depends on how deep they want to go. So if they have any understanding of philosophy, this is a crazy. This is a failure of the will as defined, in Western thought for thousands and thousands of years. The question is, would you have chosen that, right? If there was some way that you could, keep your will and drink, would you have chosen that? And I think most of us was. We're trying to kind of bend this around. I'm trying to learn how to control my drug use and my drinking, and that's what seems to be getting away from me. But I think it really is that person's relationship to this impairment and choice. And the thing that I keep going back to, and this is a lifelong struggle, believe me, that moral injury, which is a
Mm,
form of PTSD. So if you think
mm,
of PTSD as this big thing with lots of different expressions, this would be the moral injury component, which the people who were treating PTSD at the VA knew something was wrong because their typical PTSD stuff wasn't working. And this is the part of the person's trauma that they don't reveal, and that is what they did to maybe violate standards of their profession or something like that. And I think what has always served me right is I was doing the best I could with what I
mhm,
had in that moment.
mhm,
That's why I go to AA, is because I'm hoping to hear a share where people basically come to that conclusion, and also the realization that the person that I might be in conflict is also doing the same thing. The Navy and the Marine Corps were doing the best they had with what they had in that time. And for that, I certainly forgive them, but I also need to learn how to forgive myself. Right. And so I think that that's the ultimate challenge, is to be able to early on in recovery put these things in place that will stand me in good stead into the future.
mm,
Because at some point, this early brain functioning in my early recovery, rather, where I can't quite see things, that will change. And then at some point, years hence, the full realization of what I did will finally land. And if I don't have some kind of mechanism, some kind of engine, if you like, to process that shame as I become more and more conscious of it into something that can help others, then very quickly you fall into a despair that very quickly becomes suicidality. And so I think that's the beauty of sponsor and sponsee sitting down in the presence
mhm.
of, you know, uh, uh, whatever they decide, and the mechanisms of the steps is to be able to churn that shame as it comes into helping other people. What do you think of that?
Yeah, this takes me to. Uh, it was going to be a question, but it's actually I'm framing it as an experience, and I want to check in with you
Sure.
that compassion, accountability, and compassion can actually coexist.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
But my disease doesn't want me to have any compassion. It wants me to be completely accountable. And so I started to realize that all of this, well, this is what I did, and I need to be completely honest about it. And all of that was actually part of my disease. It was this sort of over shame, if you like, this over judgment of myself. And I think that's a continuous struggle. I think once you stick someone in solitary confinement for any appreciable length of time, suicide is your constant companion.
Mhm.
And I think that's the reason why you see, such terrible outcomes, is that a lot of people just never even, if anything, they become harder and harder on themselves over time. And that's, I think, a real risk.
in many ways, your life story, your story, has become the laboratory for everything you've taught ever since. Everything you've taught ever since. It really has been. If we transition to the documentary that you created a number of years ago, Pleasure Unwoven, it's helped thousands of people understand addiction a bit differently. You've been sharing a bit about that. Um, what's the single biggest misunderstanding about addiction that you still see today, even after so many years of creating that documentary?
Well, that's interesting. I think that there's been tremendous movement, quite frankly. I mean, I think very similar to the HIV/AIDS movement. Once you finally knew somebody with this, someone that you cared about, it was really very difficult to live in that same prejudice. The That was much more organized, and the big quilt and all of that. But I
Mhm.
grew up in San Francisco or at least in the Bay Area,
Mhm.
and I can remember my beloved teachers dying, and what that, I remember when Dianne Feinstein closed the bathhouses in San Francisco. No one knew what the hell to do. And
Mhm.
now we can look back on that. And I was sort of hoping that after the opioid epidemic, that we would start to see more of that. In other words, the books that are written, the plays that are made, the films that are made, even if they're very amateurish, the poems that are written, that's really what I think helps people understand the experience of a person in addiction. And I think that the world has been very generous. I don't think we had quite the talent of all of the playwrights and artists and books like that came out of the HIV/AIDS movement, but there has been art basically to
Yeah,
express that, and the world has been receptive to it. I see things, series and things like that on HBO or something like that, and they
sure.
don't quite get the experience of people in 12-step recovery, let's say, exactly right. But there's just a, a great generosity, I think, in the hearts of people the world over, as the science comes in and as these public health problems emerge, to try to do something different. So I mean, I tried to, I don't think that anyone walks away from any of my lectures or watching Pleasure Unwoven saying he said this and he said that and he said that. Nobody could pass a test on neuroscience. It just goes in and it comes out, but there's a feeling that's associated with it. There's a perspective, I think, that comes on, even when you just simply say, there is science behind addiction and it is blank. People, they make that connection. And that's, I think, what the film has the power to do.
Understanding the brain is one thing, but
Mm.
living in recovery every day is
Right.
another thing.
Yes.
It's kind of a random question, but if the addicted brain could speak, what would it say?
Uh, there's got to be a way.
Mm.
There's got to be a way to make this work. I know there is. And see, this is why I think, the more advanced neurophilosophy and the people at the very, very leading edge of neuroscience, they talk a lot about the brain as a probability calculator, that's how it actually copes with all of this incoming sensory information. It represents it probabilistically. I have to say, I don't quite understand that, but I believe that they believe that what that is. And I think what I can remember the first patient that I ever saw in medical school. This was the first few minutes of my surgical rotation when I was in the third year of my medical school. It was my surgery rotation, and it was basically the entire surgical team yelling at this patient with pancreatitis, who they knew very well, who had been in and out and had multiple bouts of pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is extraordinarily painful, one of the most painful things you can have and live. And I can remember the chief of surgery of my medical school basically screaming at this guy, "Stop drinking. You've got to stop drinking." And this guy just, with equal anger, looking back at his doctor and saying, "I would if I could." And I think that that's the appeal. Why would a person drink when they know terrible things are going to happen? Why would I inject cocaine knowing that it was like injecting liquid terror. What would cause that? And I think that this is every time the brain calculates value, it calculates likelihood. And so the part these are the words of Ken Berridge, who is a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan. In addiction, it is possible to desperately crave something that consciously you have come to hate. And so this is where it starts to come apart. Our normal ability to have a volitional experience or to have a pleasurable experience starts to come unravel. That's the idea behind the title Pleasure Unwoven. I'm taking it from the Keats poem about Isaac Newton unweaving a rainbow. And I think what the intoxicant does is it holds out a promise, ill-defined. The person couldn't put it into words. It's always in the next drink, but it literally puts the intoxicant, the person using the intoxicant, into a different probabilistic universe. And I would say it's a Marvel Comics universe filled with alternate endings and superpowers and fantasies, none of which can come true. But if reality has not been so good to you, then the suggestion that there might be a way is impossible to follow. In fact, we follow it through the gates of insanity and death. And I think that's, to me, that's what my brain, that's the essence of the term powerlessness, is that there's still a part of me that says there's got to be a way to make cocaine work. I just know that if I had the right cocaine and a vein that I could access and the right person to be with, that this would be exactly what I'm imagining in my head. And I think that that's what powerlessness is the realization that that can't happen. That maybe for other people it could, but for me, any further cocaine use has got to be in the past. And I think that that's that little framing trick that people in AA use. I think it's a pretty good one to try to, begin to get over craving, to begin to get some insight into this. What do you think about that?
Step one, right? Admitting powerlessness, right? So
Yep.
I could stay here for the next hour with this conversation. I want to transition just a bit to your second film. Film. It shifts from
manageability.
Unmanageability.
The second part of the first step.
So that second film shifts from understanding addiction to living recovery, right?
Right.
Why did you feel the second conversation was necessary at the time?
Because all the first one did was talk about the problem. And it was fascinating, but that never really was what got me sober. I could sit there and read about the neuroscience of addiction and then go shoot some cocaine and then come back and read about the neuroscience of addiction. The insight had no value. Well, it's not that it didn't have value. It's what brought me to the table. But insight is not behavior change. And so at some point there had to be behavior change. And so the second film is really the film I'm more proud of, quite frankly. It doesn't hang together very well. We actually filmed that film 3 times. Because the first 2, it just was not coming together. And it took a lot of, listening to other people, talking to other people, a lot of, I would say, soul searching and prayer, because people told me the only way that this is going to hang together is if you tell your story. And I was very much opposed to that. I was opposed to 2 things. I was opposed to really talking too much about myself and interviewing people in early recovery. I don't think it's possible to get adequate informed consent for media from a person who's in early recovery, because when they got 10 years of sobriety, they might look back at that and say, why the hell did I ever say that? I mean, I do that almost every day. Why the hell did I do that? Right? But the second film is much more about, okay, let me just lay out for you what is a very strong recovery management program that has been created for commercial airline pilots and for physicians and nurses and doctors. And how do I plug into this tradition of recovery, which is decades old and even has been replicated for college students, right? So you don't have to, have a license or be a pilot or anything. I mean, all you have to do is have an ID for your college and already is simply matriculate is to be in this environment, which is called a collegiate recovery community. And you get all the same advantages. And so let's take that apart. What are the things that we have learned really predict success in getting that person through their first year of recovery. Because once that person at least has a year, now we're in a different prognostic category, right? We're in, things get much, much better. Now, could there be relapse? Yes. Do people get 18 months relapse, 18 months relapse? Yes, they do. But I really think that once you've got that 365 days under your belt, you're dealing with a different brain. And at least you have some distance from the craving, and that's where the prognosis for long-term remission really starts to climb. But you got to support that person, right? You can't just
Right.
treat them for not 30 days or give them some support for 6 months. You got to give them a full year at least of some kind of support, on several different levels, like housing and peers and ability to go to work and things like access to healthcare, mental health care,
Mhm.
medication for opioid use disorder, alcohol use disorder. You put those things all in place. That's what we do for the professionals, and that's why they have these phenomenal success rates in getting through the first year. So that was the job of the second film, was to really get that across.
Kevin, is recovery something we achieve or something we practice, or maybe it's a little bit of both? I don't mean to be so dualistic in that question.
Well, I would call it both. I would certainly tell a person, well, I mean, this is one of the things that you can do, and as part of motivational interviewing, is really try to frame in the positive. You have 30 days, man. You look great. You look so much better than when you walked through the door. And I think we're constantly doing that. And it's not just 12-step recovery that does this. There's all kinds of different peer-based recovery that is doing exactly that. You are really, really improving your healing. You may not be able to see it. We can, and I think that achievement is something that why we take a 30-day chip, and why we take a 90-day chip, and why we take 6 months, and why we take a year, and why we take 30 years. That's the achievement celebration and the message to the person coming to their first meeting that this is possible. But the process of recovery, I think, is one that we are constantly in and out of in
Mhm.
different phases through our. I do know people who go to 3 meetings a week, and they always have for the last 20 years. Most of these people are wealthy and retired. And
Mm.
so I think that there's a little bit of a, well, I would do that, but I got, babies to feed. So there's a little bit of this that really has to be practical to the person's life. But yes, I think that in little ways, in many ways, we practice recovery, throughout the day. Uh, yeah, I remember when my now wife and I reconnected. We're both in our 40s. She had two kids who were teenagers, and they moved in with me. We lived in Utah. And I was very, very scared because I'd never been married. I'm like, what the hell? This is just going to be a disaster. And
Mhm.
within 48 hours of them moving their stuff in, I had to promptly admit that I was wrong and apologize. And they were just like flabbergasted.
Mhm.
Like they've never had an adult do that before. And it was routine. It wasn't anything that I did consciously. I just knew that we'd had harsh words, and before the sun set, I needed to do something about that.
Mhm.
And promptly admitting when one's wrong is I didn't come up with that myself, believe it or not.
No, that was back in the 30s, right?
Right.
1930s.
That's right. Using this group of
I,
drunks.
correct. I did hear you say that when you first got sober, when you first got sober, when you first got into recovery, there was a reluctance or resistance to kind of share your story, right? Share a little bit more about your own experience, right?
Mhm.
What does recovery look like today that might surprise the Kevin who first got sober?
That's a good question. Well, let me just say this. I mean, I think in early recovery, the narcissism of one's story really
Mm.
starts to take over. And you got to admit, I got a good story, right? And there was a part of that was just sort of propelling not my addiction, but my narcissism. I can remember when I got into public health school, I felt that it was my duty to go to the dean and tell him what had happened, and that there was this thing. And I can remember going, he was very busy, right? And he made some time for me, and he was sitting at his desk, he had a pen in his hand, and he's like, okay, but you're sober now, right? And I'm like, oh yes, no, I have years of sobriety. And he's like, okay, well, I'll tell you what, if you relapse, you have some trouble, come back and see me, but I got some work to do. And so it just kind of taught me that this was something that I had to come to grips with. And I think that this is what's so the one thing that you can't take away from anyone is their story. Even when you're sitting in solitary confinement, you have your
Mm.
story, right? And how we tell it and how we view ourselves in that, I think, is something that continues throughout. And I think I would say that now I'm in a phase of my recovery where I have to be careful where I'm too self-effacing, but that was not the problem early on. I guarantee you that. I'm trying to learn more about that self-forgiveness. I'm trying to learn
Mm.
more about that. I can define it and I can tell you all kinds of things. I can give you a great lecture on moral injury, but I can't seem to really achieve and now you need to let it go. And so I think that there's a part of it that is part of my addiction. I'm not using drugs anymore, but there is this sort of wallowing that I've got to be careful of. And I guess I would tell myself what I've tried to tell myself and what I try to say to patients. The way you feel about this now is not the way you will always feel about it.
Mhm.
Open your mind, just like your beautiful your what would you call it, your set aside reflection
Yeah.
says, you should try to at least open your mind to some other ways that you might think about this. And actually it was Bessel van der Kolk actually who had really great statement about the use of psychedelics in people with trauma, is that it doesn't really change your trauma, it changes your relationship to your trauma and
Mhm.
allows you to be more self-forgiving. It allows you to finally say to yourself, I was doing the best I could with what I had and what I knew at the
Mm.
time, and now trying to improve from that experience. But I think yeah, we kind of go in and out of these phases. I hope I'm not in a trough, but I would say that's kind of what I'm still working on, as the re-experiencing part of
Mhm.
complex PTSD seems to happen more and more. I'm having more dreams about those old days. And so I'm just trying to kind of walk myself through that, okay, this is complex PTSD. You're avoiding, you're re-experiencing, and you waking up in a cold sweat. And to try to use what I learn every day from some of the people who are absolutely at the top of their game
Mhm.
in trauma treatment, and really try to give myself that gift. That's hard, but I try.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Thank you. I can't help but to think about, as you talk about letting go, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, gratefully got sober, alcohol,
Yeah,
um, probably in his 50s, I would imagine, in his 50s,
yeah,
and spent the last 30 years in AA, which is great. But
yeah.
he drove an old 1976-ish, 77 Monte Carlo, and he
Right,
had two bumper stickers on the back. One said, "Easy does it," and the other one said, "Let go, let God." Right?
right.
You've spent your career immersed in neuroscience, but you've also explored spirituality in
Mhm.
thoughtful ways. So,
Yeah.
how have those worlds become friends rather than competitors? Speaking of the let go.
I think they are friends. I don't know that I'm an expert or that I should be, really holding forth on spirituality, but it
Sure.
has been, I think, a spiritual thing to watch the neuroscience come in and see
Mm.
how it fits with the words that the old timers set down to paper, many years ago. I think they fit perfectly. So I think when you're looking at an MRI of, the paucity of dopamine D2 receptors in critical reward structures of the brain, you're looking at what Dr. Silkworth was trying to explain when he said, I think these people are different. I mean, I really think that they're having a different phenomenologic experience than the average person. So to me, it's beautiful. I think how they all line up. Now, AA does not have a monopoly on any of that. I see the same thing in people who are in Life Ring or Smart Recovery or Celebrate
Yeah.
Recovery, any of those other peer-based recovery groups that have written down, what it is that they believe. It just fits quite nicely. Uh, but I'm not a religious person. I envy people who are. They just slip right into this very clear understanding of the concept of grace. Let's say I've never really had that. I did go to Christian camp a few summers when I was a kid because I had a friend who was, and I think that stood me in good stead with some of these concepts as I got into recovery. But I need to know more about that. Let's just put it that way. But I do think that when people hear the neuroscience of addiction and they have
Mhm.
a moment of, oh, that's why I do that, or at least okay, I can kind of see that, or that's why my kid acts that way, that is a spiritual moment. And I try to make sure that every person who comes through our treatment center has a few of those before they leave.
I'll put in a plug. You speak to this concept of moral injury.
Right.
I'll put in a plug for a book that I've been reading this year. I found it. I don't know how I found it, but ran across it. And so it takes the work of Bessel van der Kolk. The
Right.
body keeps the score, right? And it's this particular book is written by a Catholic priest by the name of Father Robert McChesney, and the book is named "The Soul Also Keeps the Score," where
Oh,
it speaks to
okay.
moral injury
Uh-huh.
from a spiritual, from the faith tradition. So, I'll just put a plug in since we're
Yeah.
on that.
Thank you. That will be the
Of
first thing I'll
course,
listen to.
of course. You've written about 4E cognition, 4E, the idea that the mind isn't just in the brain, but it's embodied,
Right.
embedded, enacted, and extended. How has that changed your understanding of recovery?
Well, I would say I'm a student of 4E cognition. I try my best to wade through that book, The Embodied Mind, by Thompson, Varela, and Roche. And it's impenetrable for me, but I try to listen to it. But I think that there are some important ideas there that fit very well with my understanding from public health, which is, you really can't just focus on the individual. You need to focus on the moment in time, history, the country that person is in, the resources that are there or not there, the people who are trying to exploit that person. Um, and that really brings the concept of volition or choice. I consider volition to be everything that I do when I act on my environment. So it's the memory of past actions, that the library that I keep, it's the challenge that I'm faced with right now, it's the envisioning of the future that I do. If I enact certain things, it's the actual motoric command or input that I make into the world, and then it's the assessment of the result afterwards, and the social assessment of what I just did. And you put all of those things together, that to me is my construct for volition. And I think addiction is a disorder of volition. But to truly understand choice, I've got to look at all of those things. I'll just give you a very quick example. One night we were flying in the F-18 Hornet. I was in the back seat, of course, over Central California, so my home state, and we were right over Lemoore Naval Air Station, about
Mhm.
35,000 feet. And on a clear night, you can see the entire state of California. You can see from Sacramento all the way down to San Diego. It's beautiful. It's just gorgeous. And I remember looking down in the Central Valley of California and seeing all these particularly bright spots. They were brighter than anything else. They were brighter than the oil flares in Kern County, brighter than the truck yards in Bakersfield. And I asked the pilot, I'm like, see those things down there? What are those? And he goes, oh, those are prisons. And so that to me is addiction as much as anything going on in an individual's brain. So addiction occurs at a population level too. That bad choice making also occurs in the policies of the nation within which that individual lives.
Mm.
So the advantage of embodied consciousness is that it takes the step that if you take an animal out of its natural environment, if you take a mouse or a rat and put it into a Skinner box, because you removed it from its environment, whatever conclusions you derive will always be imperfect. because really the thing that you thought you were studying was the animal in its natural environment. And I think the idea that, choice doesn't exist just in these spots that I can point to on an MRI, that it exists in the immune system. This is Dr. Levine's famous insight that trauma, lives in the body, right? And that if all I do is focus on the brain, then I'm going to miss something critical. But I would, what 4E cognition or psychiatric enactivism does is it says, well, that a mental illness is not just what's wrong in the brain or what's happening in the body, but it's the action of the individual in their environment, right? That's what helps us understand that which is a choice is really in things like this, right? So my ability to use tools in the environment, do I have access to treatment? What are the policies of my nation, that might stand in the way of ever getting sober? I think we are living through, from a public health perspective right now, where the unhealthy nature of a country is about as obvious as it can be. There are a lot of fun things that people like to say about addiction. There's the opposite of addiction is connection. I love that. I meet lots of heroin addicts who are very well connected, but I get it. I don't disagree with that. And so we have these things that we just like to say, these bumper sticker slogans, and they're fun to say, whether they're actually true or not. But I've got mine. You want to hear mine?
Sure.
The United States has an addiction problem out of proportion to other countries because it abuses its children. When you're talking about taking away supplemental nutrition for assistance to families, that's child abuse. That's child abuse in any modern country. And so we abuse our children, I would say systematically, deliberately, and with this current administration, somewhat gleefully. And that's where the disease of addiction exists too. So it's not just in the individual. We can't shoulder all of this on that person shoulders or even on that particular community that they live in. This is something that bleeds out, into the country and what certain people in the country force upon others. And so when I see those shootings in Minneapolis, I obviously feel, the most for the people who are killed and their families. I worry about that cop. I worry about that cop who's in armor, armed, probably on testosterone, right? What is the moral injury that individual will face as well? Because there are real consequences to some of the rather black thinking that has taken over at least one branch of our government. And that's a public, and I won't hide that. I'm not going to turn my back on my public health education simply because people have a problem with DEI, right? I mean, I'm not letting go of any of that. When you do an immigration raid in a county, the birth outcomes in that county, the rate of major adverse cardiac events in that county deteriorate. And that's a direct result of the aggressive policing. Whether or not you agree with the policy, and I can't say that I don't, that is addiction. That is unhealthiness. That is the disease that exists not just in the individual or in their body, but actually in that moment in time, in the entire land. You don't just have to look at track marks on people's arms to see addiction. You can get into your F-18 and fly up to 35,000 feet at night and look down, and you will see addiction. There it is. It's in the land. It actually exists on that level too. And I think that's what 4E cognition gives us, is it really brings us out and helps us see the full extent of what addiction looks like.
Powerful, Kevin. Thank you for expanding on that, sharing your lived experience and giving us something to really consider, really chew on for some time. Wonderful. Thank you again, Kevin. Thank you. I appreciate you.